Clint Eastwood strode into the courtroom, but before he could even take his seat, Judge Lawson scoffed. "This court doesn't have time for washed-up cowboys," he sneered. Laughter rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters smirked. Everyone thought this trial was just a formality. But Clint? He just cracked a slow, knowing smile. What he did next didn't just silence the courtroom. It shattered reputations, exposed the corruption at the highest level, and turned the entire justice system on its head. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The gavel slammed against the wooden block, sending an echo through the packed courtroom. Every seat was taken. Journalists, high-profile attorneys, and government officials watching with smug amusement. To them, this was entertainment, a spectacle, a chance to watch an old cowboy get humiliated in front of the world. At the center of it all sat Judge Lawson, lounging in his chair with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his life. His polished black robe barely concealed the glint of a gold Rolex peeking from his cuff. He smirked down at the defendant. "This court doesn't have time for old cowboys playing hero," Lawson scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "So why don't you just sit down and let the grown-ups talk?" A chuckle rippled through the audience. Across from him, Clint Eastwood sat as still as a stone, his weathered hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable. If he was intimidated, he didn't show it. The deep lines on his face weren't just from age. They were from experience. And experience had taught him that men like Lawson always overplayed their hand. The prosecutor, James Holloway, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. He was younger than Lawson, but carried the same smugness, as if this case was already won. He turned to Clint, flipping through his neatly organized papers. "Mr. Eastwood, you stand accused of interfering in a federal investigation," Holloway began, glancing at the jury as if rehearsing for a primetime interview. "Care to explain your actions?" Clint didn't move at first. Then slowly he leaned forward, placing his hands on the polished wooden table before him. His voice was low, measured. "Depends," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You want the truth, or just the version that keeps your little club happy?" The room tensed. A few journalists lowered their pens, suddenly realizing this wasn't going to be the predictable, open and shut case they expected. Lawson's smirk widened. "Truth?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Mr. Eastwood, the only truth that matters is mine." Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clint finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the judge's with the kind of stare that had made outlaws run in the past. His lips curled into the faintest smirk. "Yeah?" Clint murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying more weight than anything spoken in that courtroom. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Well, let's see how long that lasts." The tension in the room shifted. Suddenly, it didn't feel like Clint was on trial. It felt like the judge was. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, but prosecutor James Holloway basked in it. To him, this wasn't just a trial. It was a performance, and he was the star. Adjusting his tie, he turned to the jury, flashing the kind of confident smirk that played well on television. "Let's review the facts," Holloway began, his voice polished and theatrical. "Mr. Eastwood inserted himself into a classified federal operation, interfered with government officials, and obstructed justice." He turned dramatically, facing Clint like a showman setting up the grand finale. "That's not speculation. That's documented evidence." Clint sat still, hands folded, eyes calm. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just watched. Holloway wasn't deterred. He took a deep breath and gestured toward the courtroom's large screen. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Exhibit A." The screen flickered on. The room darkened slightly as the grainy black and white surveillance footage played. A timestamp blinked in the corner. Clear, undeniable proof. The image showed a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing Clint Eastwood's signature long coat and hat, walking through the gates of a highly restricted government facility. Security guards barely glanced at him before stepping aside. The figure moved with confidence, disappearing inside. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, whispers between reporters. A few jury members leaned forward. This looked bad. Clint remained motionless. The prosecutor folded his arms. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is your defendant trespassing on federal property. He wasn't invited. He had no clearance. He just walked right in." Holloway turned back to Clint, tilting his head. "Tell me, Mr. Eastwood, Do you often break into government buildings? A few people in the audience chuckled. Clint finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the polished wooden table in front of him. His expression remained unreadable. Then he tilted his head slightly, lips curling into something that almost resembled amusement. Mind playing that again? Clint asked, voice steady. Holloway frowned. Excuse me? I said, play it again. The judge sighed, clearly irritated. Mr. Eastwood, this is a trial, not a film review. Clint barely acknowledged him, eyes locked on the screen. Just humor me. Judge Lawson groaned and waved a hand. The footage started over. The same figure, the same coat, the same confident stride. Clint watched, nodding slightly. He let the silence hang for a beat before speaking again. Oh, I know. He turned his gaze back to Holloway, eyes sharp as a blade. But that footage, Clint smirked. Yeah, that ain't me. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The air shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't Clint on the defensive anymore. It was everyone else. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The words had barely left Clint Eastwood's mouth, but they carried enough weight to shatter the prosecution's entire case. That ain't me. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters whispered furiously into their microphones. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. Even Judge Lawson, who had been lounging smugly in his chair, suddenly sat up a little straighter. Prosecutor James Holloway, who had been riding high in confidence moments ago, scoffed and waved a dismissive hand. Mr. Eastwood, the jury saw the footage. We all did. That's you on the screen, clear as day. Clint leaned back in his chair, arms folded, his expression unreadable. You sure about that? Holloway clenched his jaw. The footage is time-stamped. You were there. Unless, of course, you have an alibi. Clint didn't answer right away. He let the room breathe in the tension. Then he turned to his lawyer, Sarah Nolan. Without a word, she slid a folder across the table. Sarah stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, the defense would like to present irrefutable evidence that Mr. Eastwood was nowhere near the location of the alleged crime. Judge Lawson raised a skeptical brow. Irrefutable, you say? Sarah nodded. On the night in question, my client was over 1,000 miles away, attending a public event, with over 10,000 witnesses. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. The prosecutor frowned. That's impossible, Sarah continued unbothered. Mr. Eastwood was a guest of honor at a charity event in Texas. We have ticket records, photographs, live-streamed footage showing him on stage addressing the crowd. She turned back to the judge. And I have sworn affidavits from multiple attendees confirming his presence. The color drained from Holloway's face. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Judge Lawson flipped through the documents, his fingers tightening around the edges. His eyes flickered toward Clint, something dark passing behind them. This complicates things, he muttered. Clint tilted his head, watching the judge with sharp curiosity. You don't seem too surprised, Judge, he said, his voice calm but deliberate. Lawson's gaze snapped to him. Excuse me? Sarah pressed forward. Your Honor, if Mr. Eastwood wasn't there that night, someone else was. Someone dressed like him, moving like him, and somehow they were able to bypass restricted security without question. A ripple of unease spread through the gallery. Clint exhaled slowly, then locked eyes with the judge, his tone shifting from curiosity to quiet certainty. And I think you know exactly who's behind it. Judge Lawson's grip on his gavel tightened, but for the first time, he didn't look in control. He looked trapped. The smirk that had been plastered across Judge Lawson's face since the trial began was gone. His fingers tapped anxiously against the bench, a subtle but telling sign that, for the first time, he was beginning to sweat. The courtroom remained deathly silent as Sarah Nolan, Clint Eastwood's lawyer, stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. Your Honor, she said firmly, the defense has obtained forensic evidence proving that the surveillance footage presented by the prosecution was digitally altered. A murmur spread through the gallery like wildfire. The press leaned forward, cameras flashing as reporters whispered into their microphones. The jury exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the shift in momentum. Prosecutor James Holloway's confidence cracked. That's impossible, he stammered. His usual composure was replaced with a stiff, uneasy posture. That footage was verified by federal investigators. Sarah didn't even look at him. Instead, she turned toward a tech specialist who had been waiting in the wings. A bespectacled man in his 40s, he carried a laptop and several printed reports. Your Honor, the expert began, adjusting his glasses, I was asked to analyze the video submitted as evidence against Mr. Eastwood. He clicked a button on his laptop, and the courtroom monitors flickered to life, playing the same footage that had been used to accuse Clint. The grainy black and white security feeds showed a figure resembling Clint Eastwood walking into a restricted government facility. But this time, the expert highlighted something different. Using deep analysis, I discovered discrepancies in lighting, shadow angles, and movement patterns, he explained, zooming in on the screen. Here, notice the unnatural transition between frames. This footage was digitally manipulated, most likely using AI deepfake technology. Gasps rippled across the room. Clint, who had been sitting quietly, finally leaned forward, his piercing eyes locked onto Judge Lawson. Huh, he murmured. You seem nervous, Judge. Lawson's hand clenched around his gavel. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Speculation at best. This court does not deal in conspiracy theories. Sarah wasn't done. Your Honor, the metadata of the video shows that it was edited just 2 days before being submitted as evidence. The original source? A private network traced back to a firm with direct ties to federal prosecutors. The words landed like a thunderclap. Even the jury, which had remained largely neutral, now looked at the prosecution with suspicion. Holloway looked pale. This proves nothing, he tried to argue, but his voice wavered. Judge Lawson's jaw tightened. He slammed his gavel down, his voice forceful but not as steady as before. Enough of this. This trial is overruled. But Clint? He wasn't moving. He leaned back in his chair, smiling just slightly, because he knew this was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Lawson's gavel still rested against the desk, but his grip on it had tightened. His smirk was long gone, replaced by a guarded expression. He had overruled the last motion, but the case wasn't slipping through Clint's fingers. If anything, it was only getting started. Sarah Nolan, Clint's lawyer, stepped forward again, her voice steady and firm. Your Honor, she said, this trial isn't just about my client. It's about something much bigger, something this court isn't supposed to uncover. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The reporters in the back exchanged wide-eyed glances, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The cameras zoomed in on Sarah, eager to catch every word. Judge Lawson let out a sharp breath. Ms. Nolan, unless you have a legal argument relevant to this case, I suggest you stop wasting this court's time. His voice was forceful, but there was an unmistakable edge of unease. Oh, I do, Sarah countered, because this trial, this entire case, is a cover-up. The room went dead silent. Even the jury, which had maintained a neutral demeanor, sat forward, intrigued. James Holloway, the prosecutor, scoffed. A cover-up? You expect this court to entertain baseless conspiracy theories? Sarah turned to him, completely unfazed. Mr. Holloway, tell me something. If my client was such a threat to a federal investigation, why wasn't he arrested immediately? Why was this case brought forward only after he started asking the right questions? Holloway's face twitched. Judge Lawson banged his gavel. Enough of this. This court deals in facts, not paranoia. Clint, who had been silent until now, finally shifted in his seat. His calm, gravelly voice cut through the tension like a blade. Funny thing about facts, Judge. You spend long enough digging, and the real ones tend to show up. Lawson's eyes flickered toward Clint, but he said nothing. Sarah took a step closer to the bench. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that Mr. Eastwood wasn't just falsely accused. He was deliberately targeted. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge narrowed his eyes. You're grasping at straws, Ms. Nolan. Clint leaned forward, folding his hands. That's so? He smirked, eyes glinting with something unreadable. Then you won't mind me bringing out my next witness. The courtroom doors creaked open, and as the next witness stepped inside, Judge Lawson went pale. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open, and every head in the room turned. For a moment, there was only silence, but the shift in energy was palpable. Something big was about to happen. A man in a dark suit strode inside, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. His presence alone sent a chill through the room. His weathered face carried the weight of years in the field, his sharp eyes scanning the courtroom like he was still on a mission. Judge Lawson's smirk, which had been slipping, vanished entirely. His fingers curled around the gavel, knuckles white. The tension in his jaw was impossible to miss. The prosecutor, James Holloway, stood frozen, his confident demeanor suddenly cracking. Who, who is this? He stammered. Sarah Nolan, Clint's lawyer, kept her expression calm but victorious. This, she said, stepping aside to give the man room, is our witness, a former government operative. Murmurs broke out across the courtroom. The media scrambled to adjust their cameras, reporters whispering among themselves. Even the jury exchanged uncertain glances. The man stepped up to the witness stand, his movements precise, as if he were still following protocol. He placed his hand on the Bible, his voice steady as he took the oath. When he finally spoke, it was like a gunshot in the quiet room. My name is Daniel Cross. I was an intelligence officer for over 20 years, and I have evidence that proves Clint Eastwood was framed by people in this very room. The reaction was instant. Gasps, whispers, chaos. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice sharp. Order! Order in this courtroom! But the uproar only grew louder. Clint remained seated, unreadable, watching everything unfold with the patience of a man who had seen it all before. The judge turned to Sarah, his voice low and strained. This is absurd. You cannot just bring in a so-called operative with unverified claims. Sarah smiled, unfazed. Oh, it's more than claims, Your Honor. She nodded at Cross. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick file of documents. He held it up for the courtroom to see. This, he said, voice unwavering, is classified evidence that was never meant to see the light of day. The judge's face darkened. His lips pressed into a thin line as his eyes flicked toward the documents. You don't want this on record, Cross said, his gaze locked onto Lawson's. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters shouting, cameras flashing. The trial was no longer just about Clint. It was now a full-blown scandal. The sharp crack of Judge Lawson's gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Enough of this nonsense, he barked, his voice strained. But no one was listening. The air in the room had changed. What had begun as a trial meant to humiliate Clint Eastwood was now spiraling into something far more dangerous. Daniel Cross, the former government operative, stood firm in the witness stand, his cold, calculating stare locked onto the judge. In his hands, he held the stack of classified documents, thick with evidence that no one was supposed to see. Sarah Nolan, Clint's lawyer, took a step forward, her heels clicking against the floor. Your Honor, these documents contain undeniable proof that not only was my client framed, but that this entire trial is part of a larger cover-up. Judge Lawson clenched his jaw. These documents are inadmissible. Classified materials have no place in this court. Cross let out a dry chuckle. Classified? He turned the first page, holding it up for the cameras. Then why do I have declassification codes right here, signed off by the very agency that tried to bury this? A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. The reporters in the gallery whispered furiously, some already typing up their breaking news headlines. Prosecutor James Holloway shot to his feet, face red. This is outrageous. Your Honor, I move to have this testimony stricken from the record. Sarah cut him off. On what grounds exactly? Her voice was razor sharp. Because it proves my client's innocence? Because it exposes corruption at the highest level? Holloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. Clint remained seated, calm as ever, his hands folded in his lap. He hadn't said a word since Cross had taken the stand, but he didn't need to. He was watching the panic unfold like a man who had already won. Judge Lawson's hand trembled as he reached for his gavel again. I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus. This trial is overruled. Sarah raised a brow. Overruled? You mean thrown out? She crossed her arms. Because you know exactly what happens if this goes to a jury. The judge's lip twitched, but he remained silent. Cross took a slow breath, his voice calm but deadly. Let me make one thing clear, Your Honor. These documents are already in the hands of federal oversight committees, major media outlets, and certain people who don't take kindly to government corruption. He leaned forward slightly. You can bang that gavel all you want, but this cover-up, it's done. Judge Lawson's fingers curled around the wooden handle of his gavel, but he didn't strike it. His face had gone pale. The power was slipping from his hands, and he knew it. Clint finally leaned back in his chair, stretching out like he was settling in for a long-awaited show. His voice was low, steady, and filled with the kind of confidence that made men sweat. Still feel like you're in charge, Judge? The judge's hands trembled. The courtroom was no longer under his control, and for the first time in his career, he was the one on trial. James Halloway, the prosecutor, clenched his jaw so tightly that a vein pulsed along his temple. He had walked into this courtroom expecting a routine case, a simple formality. But now, with the weight of damning evidence crushing his carefully crafted argument, his confidence had turned to panic. He adjusted his tie, his movements jerky, and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a notch too high. "Given the, unforeseen developments, the prosecution would like to withdraw the case against Mr. Eastwood." The entire courtroom gasped. The reporters in the back nearly tripped over themselves to get the news out first. Cameras clicked. Whispers spread like wildfire. Judge Lawson's grip on his gavel tightened. "Excuse me." His tone was sharp, but the strain in his voice was undeniable. Halloway straightened his spine, trying to maintain whatever authority he had left. "Given the discrepancies in the evidence and the unexpected witness testimony, we believe it is in the best interest of justice to—" "Justice?" Sarah Nolan, Clint's lawyer, cut in, eyes flashing. "You mean covering your tracks before this turns into a full-blown scandal?" Halloway flinched, then quickly masked it with a stiff nod. "The prosecution does not wish to pursue further action against Mr. Eastwood." Sarah took a measured step forward. "You mean now that you've been exposed?" Clint, silent through most of the proceedings, finally let out a low chuckle. He tilted his head toward Halloway. "So let me get this straight. You drag me into court, smear my name across the country, wave around fake evidence, and now because things ain't going your way, you just want to pack up and go home?" Halloway's nostrils flared. "Mr. Eastwood, this is highly irregular." Clint leaned forward. "You don't say." Laughter rippled through the audience. The once one-sided trial had flipped on its head, and everyone could feel it. Judge Lawson, still gripping his gavel like it was the last thread of power he had left, cleared his throat. "The court will consider the prosecution's request. However, given the serious nature of these allegations, But then he stopped, his eyes locked onto something or someone beyond the crowd. The color drained from his face. For the first time in his career, Judge Lawson looked shaken. Sarah noticed. "Your Honor?" But Lawson didn't respond. His breathing had gone shallow. His fingers trembled over the gavel. Clint followed his gaze and smirked. "Well now, what's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" The entire courtroom turned to see what had frozen Judge Lawson in his tracks. Someone had just walked through those doors, and they weren't supposed to be here. The tension in the courtroom was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Judge Lawson, moments ago the embodiment of arrogance, now sat frozen, his face pale. The doors at the back of the courtroom had swung open, and a well-dressed woman entered, holding a thick manila folder. Sarah Nolan, Clint's lawyer, didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, may I introduce forensic accountant Michelle Draper, lead investigator in an ongoing corruption probe." A murmur spread through the crowd like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to adjust their cameras. Even the prosecutor, James Halloway, looked stunned. This wasn't part of the script. Judge Lawson swallowed hard, gripping the bench as if it would keep him steady. "This is highly irregular," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual bite. Michelle Draper walked straight to the witness stand, unbothered by the judge's protests. She placed the folder down and opened it, revealing pages of bank statements, wire transfers, and signed documents. "Irregular?" she repeated, flipping through the pages. "Your Honor, what's irregular is that you've been accepting bribes for years, large sums of money funneled through offshore accounts in exchange for favorable rulings." The courtroom gasped. Judge Lawson's hands twitched. "That's outrageous," he snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Completely unfounded." Clint, arms crossed, and gave a slow, knowing smirk. "You sure about that, Judge? 'Cause I've seen a lot of crooks try to lie their way out of things, and you ain't doing a very good job of it." Michelle continued, unfazed by the judge's outburst. "These documents prove that over the last 5 years, you've been paid off by corporations, politicians, and most notably," she flipped a page and turned it to face the audience, "one Mr. Nathan Calloway, the same man who accused Mr. Eastwood of obstruction." Gasps erupted. Cameras flashed. Nathan Calloway was a powerful government contractor, a man known for making problems disappear. If the judge had been taking money from him, that meant this entire case had been rigged from the start. Halloway, the prosecutor, ran a shaky hand down his face. He knew he had been played. Judge Lawson slammed his gavel down, his composure breaking. I will not entertain these baseless accusations. This trial is over. But then a voice cut through the chaos. Sir, please step away from the bench. The room fell silent. A uniformed bailiff had stepped forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, not as a threat, but as protocol. Two more security officers flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Judge Lawson's breathing turned ragged. You have no authority. Michelle Draper lifted another paper from the folder. Actually, we do. Signed and authorized by the state attorney general himself. The courtroom held its breath as the bailiff took another step forward. Sir, I won't ask again. Step away from the bench. Judge Lawson had spent years ruling from his bench, treating the courtroom like his personal kingdom. But now the weight of the very system he had manipulated was crashing down on him. The bailiff's voice cut through the tense silence. Your Honor, step away from the bench. Now. Lawson clutched his gavel, knuckles turning white. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. His eyes darted toward the prosecutor's table. But Holloway, the very man who had been prosecuting Clint Eastwood, refused to meet his gaze. Everyone could see it now. This trial had never been about justice. It had been a game, and Lawson had just lost. I will not tolerate this absurdity. Lawson's voice cracked as he slammed the gavel down with a desperate force. I am the law in this courtroom. This is my court. A second bailiff stepped forward, cuffs already in hand. Not anymore? The murmurs in the crowd grew into a roar. The media, lawyers, and spectators whispered amongst themselves, cameras flashing as they captured every moment. Clint sat back, arms crossed, watching it all unfold with an amused expression. He had walked into this courtroom accused of a crime he didn't commit. Now he was watching the real criminal be taken down in front of the entire country. The moment the bailiff grabbed Lawson's arm, the judge jerked away. You have no right. This is an outrage. He turned to the jury, to the crowd, to anyone who would listen. They can't do this to me. I'm a judge. I have connections. Michelle Draper, the forensic accountant who had exposed the bribery scheme, didn't even look up from her documents as she said, Not anymore, you're not. Lawson opened his mouth, but before he could protest further, the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. A gasp swept through the room. The same man who had sentenced countless others with a smug smirk was now being dragged away, his face beet red with humiliation. The camera zoomed in as the once powerful judge was led down from the bench, escorted through the courtroom like any other criminal. His expensive robe, the very symbol of his authority, now looked like a costume, a disguise that had finally been ripped away. At the defense table, Clint remained as still as a mountain. He had said little throughout the trial, choosing instead to let the truth speak for itself. But as Lawson was dragged past him, Clint leaned in just slightly and murmured, Looks like the law finally caught up to you, Judge. Lawson's face twisted with rage, but he had no comeback, no power, no control. He was just another corrupt man, exposed for what he really was. As the doors swung shut behind Lawson, a reporter rushed forward, microphone in hand, pushing through the crowd. Mr. Eastwood, you just took down one of the most powerful judges in the state. How does it feel to win? Clint turned, tilting his head slightly. Then with that signature smirk, he simply said, I don't lose. The cameras flashed wildly, capturing Clint's final words. The clip was already going viral. But as the media frenzy exploded, Clint had already turned away, knowing this fight wasn't over yet. The gavel slammed down one last time, but this time, it wasn't Judge Lawson wielding it. It was his replacement, a no-nonsense judge who had been assigned after Lawson's abrupt downfall. The charges against Mr. Eastwood are hereby dropped, the judge announced. This court finds that Mr. Eastwood was wrongfully accused and that sufficient evidence exists to launch a federal investigation into judicial corruption. A wave of applause broke out in the courtroom. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, cameras flashed, and murmurs of disbelief filled the air. Clint Eastwood remained seated, his expression unreadable. The battle was over, but the war wasn't won just yet. James Holloway, the prosecutor who had so confidently tried to bring Clint down, slumped in his chair, his face pale. He had been part of this setup, and now, with a corruption investigation looming, his own career was hanging by a thread. As the courtroom settled, Clint's lawyer Sarah Nolan leaned over. It's done. You're free to go. Clint exhaled slowly, then stood up. But instead of heading for the exit like most men would after a legal victory, he turned and addressed the courtroom, his voice steady, firm. I appreciate y'all clearing my name, but this ain't just about me. The room quieted. Clint took a step forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. What happened here? This whole trial? This setup? It wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on justice itself. Several members of the audience nodded in agreement. How many other folks have been framed like this? Clint continued. How many got buried under false evidence because they didn't have a good lawyer? How many innocent people sat in prison while crooks like Lawson lined their pockets? The reporters ate it up, scribbling furiously. I want a full investigation, Clint said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Every case Lawson ever touched, every deal he made behind closed doors, every life he ruined. The judge hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded. This court will submit a formal request to the Attorney General's office to open a wider probe. Clint gave a slow nod. That was a start. As he turned to leave, a reporter called out, Mr. Eastwood, now that you've won, what's next? Clint paused at the doorway. He glanced back over his shoulder, giving a small, knowing smirk. This ain't just about me, he said. It's about making sure this never happens again. The cameras flashed wildly as Clint walked out. The investigation was only beginning, and the corruption ran deeper than anyone realized. The courthouse doors swung open, and the moment Clint Eastwood stepped out, a wall of flashing cameras and eager reporters closed in around him. The world had been watching this trial unfold, and now they wanted answers. Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to be a free man? One reporter shouted. Do you have any words for Judge Lawson? Another asked, thrusting a microphone forward. Was this trial just the beginning of something bigger? The questions came rapid fire, voices overlapping, cameras rolling, every major network hungry for a statement. But Clint didn't rush. He didn't need to. Dressed in his signature rugged yet sharp attire, he stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, took a slow breath, and let the tension build. The flashing lights reflected off his weathered face, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, measuring the moment. Then finally he spoke. Never let a man in a robe tell you what's right and wrong, Clint said, his voice calm yet commanding. Find out for yourself. The reporters went silent for half a second, as if processing his words. Then chaos erupted. Mr. Eastwood, what do you mean by that? Are you saying the justice system is broken? Is this a message to the people? But Clint was already moving. He tipped his hat slightly, then descended the courthouse steps without another word. The clip of his statement spread like wildfire. News stations played it on repeat, social media exploded with debates, and within hours, Eastwood versus corruption was trending worldwide. Some called him a hero, a man who stood against a rigged system and won. Others saw him as a symbol of defiance, proof that power only held weight when people allowed it to. Within 24 hours, the Justice Department announced a full-scale investigation into corruption within the judicial system. Judge Lawson wasn't the only one with skeletons in his closet. But Clint? He wasn't sticking around for the fallout. As the sun began to set, he walked down an empty street, his silhouette stretching across the pavement. He had done what he came to do. The world would take care of the rest. The legend of Clint Eastwood? It only grew bigger that day.